Today we're going to be talking about intervention in the price system. This is Chapter 6, Section 3. For this lesson, I'm choosing to use the document camera in order to better explain how this looks within a demand and supply curve. I would also recommend that you take notes along the way, since this will not be a PowerPoint posted in Schoology. So in our previous lesson, we talked about how in a truly market system, government does not intervene, and prices are completely determined by the consumer and the producer. This lesson, though, gives us more of a reality check, because in reality, in the United States, government does intervene sometimes within the price system, and we're going to talk about two ways in which the government could possibly intervene. The first system of intervention is called a price ceiling. A price ceiling is the legal maximum price that sellers may charge for a product. So this is where government has told producers they cannot sell an item at an amount higher than what they have determined. An example of this would be rent control. So in places like New York City, where they are trying to limit the rates of rent, the government has said that rent cannot be higher than a particular amount. So let's see how that appears on a supply and demand graph. Okay, so we are going to draw our supply and demand graph. Remember to label your axes, price and quantity. Your demand curve is a downward slope, and we're going to label it D1. Supply is an upward slope, and we're going to label it S1. So instead of using rent, let's use apples. So we're going to measure the supply and demand of apples. Now here, we were charging $1 per apple because that was our equilibrium. And at $1, we could sell 100 apples. Well, let's say the government steps in and says, whoa, $1 is too much to charge for an apple. You can only charge 75 cents for that apple. So they're telling us we've been charging too much for our apples, and we can only charge 75 cents. Okay, so while we were here at $1 and 100 apples, now we have to change our price to 75 cents. So if you're looking at it on the supply curve here, if we change our price to 75 cents, our producers are not wanting to produce quite as much because there's not as much of a price or profit motive. They're not going to be able to make as much here as they were there. So they're going to be providing less. And then over here, if you look at our demand curve there, you will see that our demand is still right here. People still want this many apples, but they can't get that many apples because we only have this many based on what our suppliers are bringing in. So this is called a shortage. And you can see that because our equilibrium is now out of balance. This is called disequilibrium. And now we are only producing this amount of apples, but the consumers want this amount. So that makes it a shortage. Well, let's say that the government, instead of saying 75 cents, let's say that they decide apples cannot be more than $1.25. So we would put $1.25 here, and we would draw our line across like that. And again, we are no longer in equilibrium. We are now here and here on our demand and supply curve. So let's talk about it first from our demand perspective. These are your consumers, and your consumers are saying, you know, $1.25, that's asking a little much for an apple. I don't want an apple at $1.25. But your suppliers are like, $1.25, that's great. I'm going to produce a lot of apples so I can make more of a profit. So instead of having a shortage, now we have a surplus. Because now we have too many items being produced and too few buyers. Okay? So anytime that there is a limit on a maximum price you can charge on an item, that is called a price ceiling. Okay? And one way to remember that is that if you're the producer, you always want the ceiling to be above your head, okay? Because you're not losing anything. If you are standing above the ceiling, that's a problem. Okay, so that's how I remember it. You want the ceiling above you if you have to have a ceiling, not below you if you have to have a ceiling. Ideally, you would be here, and that wouldn't change. But if the government does have to introduce a ceiling, you would rather it be here than here. Neither one is ideal, but if you were the producer, that would be your perspective. Okay, so now let's talk about price floors. A price floor is a legal minimum price that buyers must pay for a product. And really the only example here is minimum wage. Government doesn't really intervene much with price floors and say that you have to have a minimum amount you can charge. But we do put it in terms of minimum wage because the government says you cannot pay somebody less than this amount. So the supply would be pay and the demand would be how many workers you have. Okay, so let's look at price floors. And the previous one we did apples, so this time we're going to do oranges. So we're selling oranges this time. Remember that we have to label our axes, price, and quantity. Draw your demand curve, label it D1, your supply curve, S1, okay? And again, let's say that you are selling apples, or sorry, we're on oranges now. Selling oranges for 50 cents each. And at 50 cents each, you're able to sell 500 oranges. And that's your equilibrium. That's where it's kind of that sweet spot between demand and supply. So the government decides that they are going to issue a price floor, a minimum amount that you could be charging for your oranges. And they say, minimally, you have to charge 75 cents per orange. Well, now that puts us out of disequilibrium. We're no longer here where we want to be because that's this agreement between our consumers and our producers. The government is telling us we have to be here. We have to sell our items at least for 75 cents. So, looking at that, our suppliers are here and our consumers are there. So now we have a price increase just like we did before when we did this with apples. And because of this price increase, we have fewer consumers wanting to purchase those oranges. So maybe now we're down to 350 in demand. And our producers are excited because now they're going to make more money at 75 cents an orange instead of 50 cents an orange. And so now they are going to have 650. Okay, so they're providing 650 oranges, but there's only a desire for 350. That's a problem. Okay? And so, again, because this line is above equilibrium, we are supplying more than we are demanding. We, again, run into a surplus. Now we're going to have more oranges than we need, and that's going to result in a surplus. Okay? Now, if the government says, hey, we're setting a price floor for 25 cents. Every orange sold has to be more than 25 cents. Okay, so we're here and we're here. If these producers decide to go with that and are like, yeah, we'll charge 70 or 25 cents per orange, they don't really have the incentive to provide any more because they're losing money now from going from 50 cents to 25 cents. So there's really that motivation and profit motive. And your consumers, though, are like, heck yeah, we want this 25-cent orange instead of the 50-cent orange. So they are wanting more. And so your demand now is greater than what's being supplied. So if your demand is greater than what's being supplied, now you have a shortage. Okay, so anytime that there is disequilibrium and you have one line above, that's a surplus. Or if you have a line below, that's going to be a shortage. Okay. Something else to keep in mind, remember we said we always want a ceiling to be above our heads if we're the producer, not below us. The opposite is true for the floor. As a producer, you always want the floor to be below you because that means you can charge more than that item. This is just the minimum. You do not want the floor to be above you. That is not a good thing. Not that this is a good thing. It's really not. But at least you could kind of set your own price and kind of get yourself back to that sweet spot if you wanted to. The last thing we're going to talk about is kind of the effects of this government intervention. So the first one is rationing, a system in which the government allocates goods and services using factors other than price. So sometimes there's no price ceiling and no price floor. They just say, look, this is the amount that each family can have, or this is the amount that people can have because we are running low on resources. So they would force people to ration. The black market, though, is an effect of price ceilings and price floors and the government intervening in prices. And so the black market is goods and services are illegally bought and sold in violation of price controls or rationing. So the example here is bootlegging alcohol in the 1920s. Hopefully you learned about that in your previous history classes. So this concludes our lesson on price ceilings and price floors and government intervention into the price setting system. If you have questions, please let me know.